quick disclaimer. This show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. We do not recommend or endorse any healthcare providers or treatments. The use of information presented on this podcast is at the listener's own risk. Please do your own research. This is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you are ill, do not delay seeking advice from your doctor. And finally, the views expressed by the hosts of this podcast do not represent the views of any official organization, hospital, or institution. Welcome to the External Medicine Podcast, where we explore ideas currently on the outskirts of medicine. My name is Daniel Belkin, and I'm a third-year medical student at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And I'm here with my friend and co-host, Mitch Belkin, a third-year medical student at the University of Maryland School of Medicine.
Thank you, my dear friend and co-host, Daniel.
So, Mitch, do we have any news today?
Why, yes. We are maybe going to start sending stuff out to our mailing list.
Yeah, but you won't find out unless you sign up. So if that maybe right there set your curiosity aflame, sign up today at externalmedicinepodcast.com. We also have some pretty exciting interviews coming up. So if you haven't subscribed to our podcast, now would be a good time. Do we have any financial disclosures today, Mitch? Has anyone donated large sums of money to our podcast?
No financial disclosures. Today's interview is with Dr. Nir Barzilai. He's the founding director of the Institute for Aging Research, and he's an expert in the genetics of longevity. He's a professor in the Department of Medicine and Genetics at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. He is the recipient of numerous awards and grants. He's published over 230 peer-reviewed papers, reviews, and textbook chapters. And he is also the author of the book Age Later, published in 2020.
Dr. Barzilai is currently leading an international effort to approve drugs that can target aging. The Targeting Aging with Metformin trial, also called the TAME trial, is a study designed to prove that morbidities of aging can be delayed with metformin.
In the interview, we talk with Nir about the field of gero-therapeutics, the hallmarks of aging, and gender differences in aging. We review his work on centenarians and what they can teach us about aging. Finally, we delve into metformin, its use as an anti-aging therapy, the mechanism of action, as well as the TAME trial, on which Dr. Barzilai is the primary investigator.
We are here with Dr. Nir Barzilai. Nir, thanks for joining us today.
A pleasure to be with you guys.
Before we begin, do you have any financial disclosures around metformin?
Around metformin? No, metformin is generic. It's cheap. Nobody makes money out of it. I do have, I'm a founder of two biotechs in the field of aging, but I'm not going to talk about anything, just to say really what I'm telling you now by this disclosure is that aging is not only something that is flexible, that can be targeted, but there's a development of gero-therapeutics and geroprotectors, and I am involved in that, but they're not available to you at this time, and I'm not going to talk about them.
So, Nir, can you please tell us a little bit about your biosketch and how you describe to people what it is that you do?
Well, my biosketch is a problem because I'm 100 years old. You know that? I'm 100 years old. So if you live long life, if you live long enough, you get a big bio. But the important parts of my bio is that I was born and raised in Israel, and my wife imported me here. We met when I was a fellow at Yale, and she was in New York, and life has changed, and I ended up coming here. But from an aging perspective, they say that kids have imagination, but I bet with you that kids don't look at their grandparents and say, oh, I know how I'm going to look like in 70 years. They just think it's, I don't know how they got to be the way they are. They don't see themselves being there. And for me, it was like, I just cannot believe it. My grandfather is telling me stories of what he's done when he was young, and he looks like he can barely move. I mean, are you kidding me? And this is something that remained a curiosity throughout my life. Since a lot of the people who are listening are medical students and doctors, I'll tell you, when I was doing my residency at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, and I had an attending that, when you present a case, you say this is a 50-year-old woman, and you move on. And he said, just a minute, stop. You said the age. Does the patient look younger than his age or older than his age? Which really is asking, is the biological age and chronological age the same? And we know, by the way, that it's not, right? I mean, you see around you, you see your parents, you see their friends, you know that there are some people whose aging is slow and some is fast. And you kind of started doing that, and starting to understanding in a very intuitive way that it really matters. There are 80 years old that it's their end, but they're 80 years old that you look at them and said, oh, the fight is worthwhile here, and it makes an effect on what you do. So maybe those are the major point. But I had large experience in third world medicine. I was in wars, in battles, and so I had a totally whole different perspective of life and medicine before I came and became mainly a scientist or a geroscientist.
And were you interested in endocrinology before you did your endocrinology fellowship at Yale? Is that right?
Yeah, at Yale and in Cornell. And the reason is that although I was interested in aging, there really were very few people who are interested in this field, and even fewer that were biologists. And I thought, and it was a very naive thought, that, what happened with aging, there's lots of hormones that are going down, and maybe all you have to do is just replace those hormones, and you cure aging. It happened to be a major mistake. In fact, it's probably exactly the opposite. But endocrinologists are smart people, and metabolism is very relevant to aging, and it was a good place to get my training.
If you were going to give a definition of aging, what would it be?
What I usually describe to lay people, I tell them about this couple that lives in a house in the Middle West, and the woman turns to her husband. They're 80 years old, right? And the woman turns to her husband. She said, "Honey, why don't we go upstairs and make love?" And the husband looks at her and says, "Sweetie, I cannot do both." Okay, because every other definition will be more complicated. And so I don't want to go about definition. I'll use the opportunity in next questions maybe to tell you what are the hallmarks of aging from a biological perspective.
Sure. Yeah. What are the hallmarks of aging?
So the geroscientists, what happened is we moved from hope that maybe we can do something about it to promise that we can do something about aging. And how did we do that? We decided on hallmarks of aging. How do you become a hallmark of aging? If we showed that something is changed with aging, let's call it decline generally, it can be up or down, but if there's a decline with aging and you can fix it, and then your animals live healthier and longer, well, you become a hallmark. Which is, by the way, not the same as saying that those are the causes of aging recently, the causes of aging. But the nice thing about hallmarks is you can fix one, and by that you fix also others. You really don't have to fix everything in order to get the progress in aging. And I'll give you an example of some of those hallmarks, and I don't want to get too much into it because it'll it's a longer explanation, and probably it's one of those things in biology that you might need a slide because some of that is not totally known. But from the COVID, that one of the things that happened is a decline in immunity, right? That's why this virus that has no eyes knew exactly how to pick on the old people and kill them. And if you were over the age of 80, your chances of dying from COVID are 200 times more than if you're in your 20s. Uh, so getting the virus is one thing. The second thing is inflammation, which is one of the hallmark. And inflammation is really what ends up killing those guys, after a few days, right? Famously, the fifth day you get this lung inflammation, and people don't survive that. But of course, it's not only the immunity, it's not only inflammation, it's also things that influence the rest of the body, because you have to have a strong body to sustain a disease that's quite severe.
So the description you're using is, as we get older, there are certain biomarkers that go up and some that go down. And some of those are, protective against aging, and some of those are causing aging. And it's not always obvious when you're looking at a list of these things, which ones are helping and which ones are hurting, but they all sort of can be fit into categories like inflammation and immunity.
Uh, No, you must have prepared, okay, for this talk, because you just mixed two things. And biomarkers is a different issue. So let me just make sure the hallmarks that I'm talking beside immune decline and beside inflammation are things like proteostasis, okay? We make proteins and some of them are garbage, and this is increased with aging. And there's a removal mechanism for garbage by the ubiquitin, mainly by autophagy. Autophagy is the garbage disposal, right? The green garbage disposal. We can take the garbage and break it down to to amino acids and lipids and everything, and even use it again. Okay, and this is what declines with aging. That's why we get Alzheimer's and Parkinson, because we start to accumulate things that are pretty much garbage. There's genetic stability that is declined, some of it because telomeres are going down. There's a mitochondrial dysfunction, the mitochondrial number and function are decreases. Those are the biological hallmark for aging. Biomarkers is something different. Biomarkers is a real challenge for us because cholesterol, right, blood pressure are markers. Cholesterol is a great biomarker for heart disease because it's also causative, and if you decrease it, you know that you'll prevent heart disease. By the way, I should just stop and say the risk of cholesterol and heart disease is something like threefold, maybe fivefold in some studies. The risk of aging for death from cardiovascular disease is 1,000-fold. Okay, there's no comparison between aging and any of those other risks, but the biomarker is much more complex with aging, um, because there are many biomarkers, and the ones that we haven't really focused on, or not focused on, but we haven't established, and there's no consensus, is the ones that when you give a gero-therapeutics will predict that it will work. Okay, that's what we need. Like the cholesterol, something that we know, well, if we see that's going down, then we'll, in few weeks or months, we'll figure out if this is a real biomarkers for aging, and then we'll have a treatment. Now what we have to do is do like a phase 3 trial in order to see if it works for aging, right?
Could you please define what gero-therapeutics are?
Yes, the geroprotectors or gerotherapeutics are the drugs or the intervention that will target the biology of aging, because it is the biology of aging that drives those diseases. You see, what we're doing now, we can somewhat prevent single disease or treat single disease. But because aging is a cause for all those diseases, and what I told you about heart disease is true for cancer, for Alzheimer, for diabetes, then our idea is, why don't we prevent aging? And by that, prevent not one disease, but will prevent all diseases. And that's what we need to do now. Remember, what we're seeing now is people after the age of 60 getting one disease and its treatment. It can be a severe disease and the treatment can be lousy, and then a second disease and another treatment, and we're accumulating those diseases in the treatment, and the treatments are also antagonistic to each other. This doesn't need to happen. we've shown we've shown that we can target aging, we can increase lifespan and health span of animals, and that it's not so hard to do. It's much harder to treat cancer than to prevent aging.
So you're describing like gero-therapeutics is an innovative way of dealing with many diseases all at once. Like typically you would just target cancer or just target heart disease, just target COPD or pneumonia or these various things. And gero-therapeutics attempts to tackle them all at once because they're all correlated.
Not correlated. I'm talking not about correlation, but about causation, right? Because they're caused by the same process.
You just mentioned health span versus lifespan. Can you elaborate on that distinction?
Yes. So look, it's kind of a marketing point. There are two books out there this year. One is my colleague David Sinclair, who wrote a book. He's a biologist at Harvard, and he called his book something with lifespan. And I had a book called Age Later. It's on health span. And the truth is that if we target aging and prevent diseases, that's health span, we also will increase lifespan. The problem is, and I'm investigating exceptional longevity, right? I have centenarians that I'm looking at. And whenever I talk about longevity, people assume that, okay, they get sick whenever they get sick, and now they live sick for longer. And it is really important to say, no, we're not about the longevity. We're about the health. In fact, I often say that when there's an advertisement for a gero-therapeutics, and it will say, you live healthier, and then there's the side effect. One of the side effects is living longer. Maybe you cannot afford to live longer. Maybe you don't want to live longer. Maybe you don't want to go with this life with this person you live with, right? I mean, so that's the side effect. But really, it's a tied mechanism.
Can you talk a little bit about your work with centenarians and what you've learned from those studies?
Yes. So I accumulated through the last couple of decades 750 centenarians and their families. For a variety of reasons. Not only that, they're all Ashkenazi Jewish. The reason is because I'm looking for longevity genes. And if you want to do genetic studies, it's nice for a discovery to work in a very well-defined population. The Icelandic are 500,000 people, but they're all kids. They're all children of 5 Vikings and 4 Irish women. So they're kind of brothers, cousins. And so the background is not like going in New York and picking everybody in the street from every color and race and things. So it's an advantage. Also, my population has the advantage, and they're not known to have longevity. It's not because of that. The advantage of the population is that also they have a relatively similar education background. The average years at school of our cohorts is 17 years. And this has an effect on health span, on health, on lifespan, because that's how it is in the United States, unfortunately. People uneducated who are poor are living much shorter, much shorter than people who are educated and have more means. And the first thing that we wanted to see is what I just said. Do they get diseases when everybody gets diseases and now they live like that for the rest of their lives? Or is their lifespan and health span connected? And the answer, it is connected. They actually live 20, 30 years healthier, longer healthy than control. Now, the control is current. They've been starting their lifespan 30 years before that. And at that time, their friends would die on an average age of 40, in the beginning of the 1900. So their lifespan and health span have been increased tremendously. But this is not the only interesting thing about them. The interesting thing is they have a contraction of morbidity. In other words, they are sick very little time at the end of their lives. And even the CDC looked at the medical cost in the last 2 years of life of somebody who lived to be over 100, and the medical costs are third than those who are dying in their 70s. So there's a contraction of morbidity and what we called longevity dividend. It is trillions and trillions of dollars saving if we could just be healthy and then die one day, which is pretty much the example that we have.
What about these centenarians from your studies allows them to live longer?
So first of all, there's no single gene that will make them live longer, okay? And so we're looking for all those genes. But as an example, the pathway, and we actually have to go away from a single mutation, right? Or a single SNP, because we're not built of a single SNP. We're built of many SNPs and they can cancel each other. So it's really important to look at the pathway. And the pathway that is impaired in 60% of our centenarians is the growth hormone pathway. So it's not only growth hormone, it's growth hormone, IGF, it's everything that is in this system, which is, by the way, conserved even in evolution. And it's really the most of our centenarians have something that impairs this pathway. And really what it means is that you have, when you age, you have to get your energy away from growth because you need it now to do repair. Okay, so if you could stop the growth so that you can do repair, it has an advantages. And that's why every time that the growth hormone signaling or effect is going down, it is substantially better for aging in humans.
Is there a difference between males and females when it comes to this pathway?
There's differences between male and female in many aspects of aging, including gero-therapeutics. So, and we missed it because we usually use male animals for reasons that were never really justified. We said, we don't know the female, the menstruation of the female, so who knows if that's a fact. But in fact, the biology of sexes is very different and it's getting more different with age. So the NIH, the NIA, the National Institute of Aging, has a program that's called ITP. It's the Intervention Testing Program, where if you have an ID for any drug that you think will target aging, you can tell them and they will set in a multicentral study with mixed mice model, they'll set up a study and will really confirm it has effect on lifespan and health span. And there are several drugs that have been very successful, but many of them, I would say most of them, but not all of them, have effect or major effect on one gender and not the other, one sex and not the other. So it's important. It's true for the growth hormone signaling pathway. It is much more, the women are much more sensitive to this effect than males are.
What do you mean by women are more sensitive to the effect than males?
Well, so women who have, so I'll give you this example. We looked at our centenarians. So our centenarians got to be healthy at their age, and we take, their DNA, we take also their plasma. So we measure, IGF-1 level. And we looked at the IGF-1 level and uh, going forward, because the centenarians, they reached this mark, but then they have 30% chances of dying next year, right? Every year after. So we looked at the survival according to IGF-1 levels. And those with the lowest IGF-1 level lived like twice as long. But not only that, they had better cognitive function, and their muscle function wasn't impaired, although we think that IGF is very important for the muscle, but the muscle function was just the same. With males, there wasn't any effect on longevity, and not on cognition, and not on muscle. So it was kind of a flat effect in our population, um, except one interesting genotype. We have a deletion of exon 3 of growth hormone receptor, which is a male, which happens mostly in male with longevity. They have low IGF-1 levels, but longevity, and they're doing well otherwise. So that's an exception. But mostly this every one of those drugs and many of those pathways are important more for one sex than the others.
Can you tell us about how you got, we're going to switch over to talk about metformin now. Can you tell us how you got to be interested in metformin?
That's a little serendipitous. So when I told you I did my fellowship at Yale, it was 1987. Metformin. Let me just tell you that in the 1950s, metformin was used to prevent flu and malaria. And at that time, it was discovered that people on metformin who are diabetic have lower glucose level. Then it became a diabetic drug. And it's been in use for 70, 80 years around the world, but the United States was very slow in getting it in. And in 1987, basically, people did the first studies on metformin, and I was at Yale a fellow, and my project was to find the mechanism of action of metformin from a diabetes perspective. And although my whole fellowship was really what I wanted out of this fellowship, to see the difference between insulin action in young and old people, my project was actually metformin, and I had no way to know that in the future it's going to be the same, exactly the same thing. So then 30 years ahead, and by the way, I'm a diabetologist, and once a week, if I'm around, I'm attending in diabetes clinics. So I know metformin for years. Uh, but the interesting thing, and we all knew it in diabetes, that people on metformin were doing better in clinical studies and in association studies. The diabetes prevention trial showed that metformin prevents diabetes in non-diabetics. And the UK-PDS study have shown that people on metformin have less cardiovascular disease than people who are treated on other drugs. People on metformin have 30% less cancers, all kind of cancer, all cause of cancers. People on metformin in clinical studies and association studies have less cognitive decline and Alzheimer. And really the coolest study was a study that you could do only in the UK. Still, you can do it. You cannot do it in the United States. In the UK, you can go to the pharmacies and get information on patients, and even kind of match them. It's like a phase 4 trial. It's like a post-marketing trial. So they included like 180,000 people, and they took 4 groups. One group was people who were using sulfonylurea. This is the other anti-diabetic drug. And they matched them to control. Those are people without diabetes, and they showed that people with the metformin have twice the mortality, 5 years mortality. People with sulfonylurea have twice as much mortality than non-diabetic. Okay, that wasn't a surprise. But then they took 78,000 people with metformin and matched them with 78,000 people, same pharmacy, same doctors, but they do not have diabetes. And what was surprising is people on metformin with diabetes, who were also, by the way, more obese and with more diseases to start with, had 17% less mortality, significantly less mortality than people without diabetes. So, if you take all of it together, you see that there's also huge proof of concept that metformin, improves health span and delays mortality.
Just to make sure that I understood what you're saying. So you're saying in this UK study, they took patients that were on sulfonylureas, they took patients that were on metformin, and controls for each group. And not only did the metformin patients outperform the sulfonylurea group, the metformin patients who had diabetes and lots of other comorbidities outperformed the patients that were the controls.
Exactly. You in metformin, you have less mortality even if you have age-related diseases.
Is there an understood mechanism for metformin causing fewer cancers?
That's a good question. And when we were organizing this trial, we went among institutes. Let me make a comment that is very important for all of you to understand. We have the National Institutes of Health, right? It's institutes. You have the National Cancer Institute, of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood, and you have, and so on and so on. Actually, you have institutes for diseases. You don't have institutes for health. The only institute for health is actually the National Institute of Aging, where we're trying to talk about health. And the problem is, it's understandable how you got to this situation. But now there are silos, right? There are silos, and those silos you cannot break. So when you come and talk with the NHLBI and you said, the risk for cardiovascular disease is aging, and they said, no, we're not interested in aging, it's cholesterol. And not only that, they do all their studies in animals are young animals. And the major point here is the biology of aging is very different between young and old. So you're not working on the right platform. And then you're surprised that you cannot develop drugs. You don't develop drugs for the right conditions, okay? Alzheimer's, okay, even if you have very strong genetics, you're not declining cognitively when you're 1 year old or 10-year-old or 20 or 30 or 40, right? It takes you 60, 70 years to develop this disease because you need aging in order to bring out this disease. It's a bias that's really incredible. So when we went to the National Cancer Institute and we showed them, and actually they also had the paper that surprised them. They wrote a paper, metformin seems to have all those anti-cancer effects, but in their mind, every cancer is its own disease. And in a way, yes, it's true in a way. The inheritance, there's some genetic specific, it's true. But the point is that for most cancers, I said you go from 1 to 500 with aging. Still, the risk factor is aging. And what we're saying, let's take the aging part of the cancer, okay? And maybe this individual will never get cancer once we do that. And I think it's kind of accepted with metformin. It's only prostate cancer that doesn't come clean every time. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, but all the other cancers, okay, there's evidence, not clinical studies, but association that there's less cancer there. And we understand that. because we know what metformin is doing from the biology of aging perspective.
Can you talk a little bit about metformin's effects in the body and in the cell? Just a general overview.
The most important thing to know is that metformin affects all the 9 hallmarks of aging. Okay. And if you want more, there's a recent paper we wrote in Cell Metabolism, and you can look at each one of them and how. And not that it really targets directly every one of the hallmarks, but I told you it's enough to target one hallmark to get effect on the other. And the reason is, if you take an old cell or an old organ or an old body and you make it young, you're going to fix a lot of things. And we used to fight about metformin does that. No, it does that, it does that. Well, it does, once it fixes everything, it does a lot of things. The question is, what caused the major effect that got the cell to be younger now? And what metformin does, it goes through a transporters into the mitochondria and block complex 1. That's, we believe, is the most important mechanism, but it's not the only mechanism that happens. Once it block complex 1, on one side, there's a lot of metabolic adaptation to this decrease in complex 1 activity that includes also improvement in insulin action and also activation of a sensor that's called mTOR, that is major nutrient sensing in aging. And if you block mTOR, you start autophagy, and you get a lot of other benefits. So on one hand, metformin is doing that. On the other hand, metformin also blocks oxidative damage because the complex 1 slows the mitochondria activity, and it has also effects on many other biology, including inflammation. And that's as complex as I want to be with you guys.
You've done studies on metformin in animal models, right?
Well, I've done in humans, in animals and humans. What we do when we have a geroprotector, we recruit older subjects, and we, in a double-blind crossover design, we give them those geroprotectors. So we did a study with metformin where half of the patients got metformin for 6 weeks, and then we did a washout of 2 weeks, and then 6 weeks we switched between the metformin and placebo. So you either started on metformin or ended on metformin. And after each part, we did a biopsy of muscle and adipose tissue. So we have variety of cells to work on and see the effects of metformin. And basically what we showed is metformin changes the transcripts to a more younger transcript in the muscle and adipose tissue, and that it's not metabolic specific. It affected, cancer genes and collagen genes, and it's not only the metabolism itself.
There was a point that you made earlier on about that we have proof that there are drugs, including metformin, that could make people age later. And I know that the study that you just described is looking at adipose tissues and looking at muscle cells to actually look at the transcripts and proteomics. But in terms of prolonging lifespan in animals, what data is there that there are drugs that could prolong lifespan?
So I mentioned the ITP, the intervention testing program, that is completed by now, I think, like 40 major studies. And by the way, the latest success was the SGLT2 inhibitor. It's the new drug for diabetes. And it was surprising. It was surprising on 2 parts. It was surprising first to get the clinical trial, and show that every clinical trial that they've done, mainly on diabetics, but not only on diabetics, have also improved cardiovascular endpoints and kidney endpoints. Um, and that's what we're interested when a drug affects several diseases. That's what, which metformin is doing, right? It makes us really excited. And this was the week of October 8th, New England Journal of Medicine, October 8th. There are 3 studies like that about SGLT2. That's 2020, right? Several studies. And at the same week, there was a JCI paper on the ITP that are saying, look, it increases lifespan, by the way, on males and not as much as on females, which is not clear. It seems that in humans it does both. It might have to do with levels, pharmacology, pharmacodynamics, it's still to be tested, but it's an example of a drug that, as far as I'm concerned, is gero-therapeutics, and you could probably use it in non-individual, metformin and SGLT2 are drugs that lower glucose only if it's high, okay? For normal people, all it will do, it will decrease insulin levels, okay? Insulin level will work on lower levels to do the same thing. It's not going to cause hypoglycemia, which many people are assuming. In diabetic, a lot of our drugs are anti-hyperglycemic drugs and not hypoglycemic drugs anymore. But this is example of a drug that does that. Statin, and another thing with those drugs, metformin you give to animals, you give to nematodes, and they live longer. Okay, aging is conserved. All the animals are the same thing. Their hair, their skin, they get diseases. Okay, they move less. So a lot of the testing of those drugs is, if it works in several animals, it's probably going to work in humans. It's the same mechanism. Statins is a very important drug, okay? Because we humans have this specific cholesterol stuff and we're not handling it well. But statins, if you give to animals, they don't live longer. It's not a gero-therapeutics. In fact, with statins, overall mortality doesn't change, which is weird. Cardiovascular mortality changes, okay? But overall mortality doesn't change, which means statin kills you for other reasons. I actually published, must be almost 2 decades ago, one of the first group that discovered that statin increased the risk for diabetes by 2.5-fold. So statin is doing some other things, probably. I'm not taking away from statin. I'm just saying that's not a gero-therapeutics.
This is probably a good transition now to the TAME trial. Can you tell us how you came up with it and what's so special about it?
So you must be hearing me and saying, everything that we need to do to know about metformin is there. It's also generic. Why don't we just give it to people? And metformin for us is a tool. A tool for what? Well, the FDA doesn't have indication to prevent aging or even to prevent a cluster of age-related disease or prevent mortality. So we need to prove this concept in order to allow for better drugs, combination drugs, for pharmaceutical to come along and develop better things. Look, if TAME doesn't have, if metformin has no indication, or if a gero-therapeutics has no FDA indication, healthcare providers don't need to give you this drug, okay? And pharmaceuticals will not jump in and develop better drugs because they need a business plan, obviously. So we need to break this. It's holding our field. It's holding our field. So we have been discussing with the FDA what kind of study to do and what would be, how do we call it, we were considering maybe we should call aging a disease, okay? Because the FDA is okay with giving drugs for diseases, but not for prevention of all of them. That's not something that's conceptual accepted to our great dismay, right? So, but we don't need to. We all agreed that we're going to show that there's a cluster of diseases that moved in time until occurrence of cardiovascular, cognitive, cancer, and mortality endpoint. You get the point for each one of them. No matter what it is, you get the point. But we will show that the time is farther delayed with metformin than with placebo. That's the idea, and that's why we do the TAME. I'm not really interested in the results because it's all been done. It just hasn't been done on one trial, right? It's been done on several trials. The cool thing is we're taking people between age 65 and 80. And at this age, you get a lot of outcomes. If we needed to monitor to just look at diabetes, we would need 12,000 people. But if we have more outcomes, we need only 3,000 people. Okay, because we are kind of agnostic. We're agnostic to the disease. We don't know what disease you come with. We don't know what disease you'll get, but you'll get it later. Okay, that's the idea here. That's the cool idea here. So that's what we're hoping to show, and by that to make a profound change, so it will be clear, also to pharmaceuticals, to physicians, to everyone, that aging is a good target.
What was it like negotiating with the FDA to get this trial started?
So there is a wonderful movie by Ron Howard, the producer, who it's called The Age of Aging. It's in National Geographic. It's the best movie that's been done about aging. And he moved with us through these concepts, and he came with us to the FDA, okay? And he interviewed then people with the FDA. And it is, it looks dramatic, and it was dramatic for us. For us, it was, we are already frustrated. We're running late, and it was a very important meeting to have. So just to tell you how the FDA is, when you go to somebody else, and I went to the Congress and I went to senators. I mean, there's a lot of interaction, and it's just interesting to see how concepts are changing. So one of our prevention was of diabetes. Okay, not only heart and cancer but diabetes. And the FDA said, we don't want prevention of diabetes. Now, I'm a diabetologist. And I was like, what? So the FDA, this is how the FDA thinks. They say, look, people who get diabetes, okay, so 40% of them in 10 years will have complications. It's not the same for us like having a heart attack, having Alzheimer, having a cancer. Okay, it's not at the same level, or dying, right? It's not at the same level. They said, we want diabetes out. So we had to go and calculate again how many people without, now without diabetes. And that's how the FDA views diabetes. So, that was an example.
What is the status of the TAME trial right now?
So the TAME trial, look, the TAME trial for reviewers who are not in the National Institute of Aging, right? Because we're all in the team, living in their silos, they basically reviewed TAME and said, you want to tell us that aging can be targeted and one drug can do it? You're out of your mind. Get out of here. That was basically the response. They even didn't read the introduction or the overwhelming gero-science that is out there. Some of the best papers everywhere in Nature Science are all on the biology of aging and how you can prevent it. And people who are doing studies just couldn't see that. And we engaged the American Federation of Aging Research, and we decided to go to philanthropy and to go to foundations. We were close to starting the study before COVID, and luckily we didn't, because this would have been a problem. And there's a foundation that's going to come up in May that we believe it's, so I have to be careful because the money is not in the bank, but we believe not only that it will do the TAME trial, but it'll do 5 TAME-like trials in order to really get this going.
You mentioned COVID. You had started the trial prior to COVID, and then COVID happened, and then it complicated things. Has there been any evidence around metformin and COVID?
A lot, a lot. There are 9 studies around the world that showed that people who were on metformin and got COVID had less hospitalization and huge decrease in mortality, between 50 and 67% decrease in mortality. Now, this is not clinical studies, right? This is only association studies. But when you have 9 studies that are showing pretty much the same effect, okay, you can blame association study as much as you want, but metformin that was used for infection disease initially is probably a great drug. And I'll tell you, my in-laws were elderly in an old age home. I put them on metformin immediately. I wasn't going to take any chance. I would tell you that my wife and I are on metformin. We both had an excuse, we're pre-diabetic, and we're not anymore. But we both had COVID in the first week of April, and we continued working. We kind of were a little tired. We took Tylenol, and in 2 weeks we were better. And we think that it's probably the metformin that helped us stay out of trouble.
What was the dose that you are currently recommending to your relatives and yourself? And I wanted to follow up as well on the trial dosage.
Yeah, well, it's the same answer. First of all, I don't like being on record as recommending, because I'm leading this trial. I'm not trying to get people to take metformin before the trial is done, okay? It's very important, especially for us, that we'll have clinical trials before we come and recommend this thing. So let me come here clean. I thought that COVID is a war and we have to be creative, okay? And we're afraid and we didn't know what to do. And this is why I got it, but I'm not recommending it before there's evidence. Unfortunately or fortunately, people who are interested in aging are on metformin. The sales of metformin have doubled in the last 5 years because of the papers we're writing about, of the evidence, about them seeing the movies, hearing podcasts. So, you know, this is out there. Now, the dose, so when we decided on the TAME trial, you know, some said, you know, we should double the dose for elderly because we really want to have an effect. And the other part said, are you kidding? Those are older people. I would half the dose. Who knows how they're reacting? And so what we decided is to go with the dose where the clinical studies happen, which is about 1,500 milligrams. And that's what we're doing with TAME, and that's where we're trying to get, and that's what I'm taking.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today, Nir.
Can I make a last point? I want to make a very important point. This is not only about the elderly, in case you don't like the elderly, okay? Look, people who survive cancers because they get chemotherapy and radiation, okay, that is part of the hallmarks of aging, okay? They attack some of the hallmarks of aging. They age really rapidly, in particular children at age 35 with cancer survival are old. HIV, they get diseases 10 years before people their age. People who are debilitated or in wheelchairs or something that they cannot move, you know, and they eat more, they need help. I would say that poor people in the United States that cannot afford good food or exercise, maybe you should think metformin is the cheapest drug in the United States. It can achieve it because you're not going to get them good food or exercise. And if we really want to get to Mars, okay, we cannot get there before we have gero-therapeutics, because by the time we get there, we have cancer or heart disease and we'll never make it back. Okay, so there's a reason for geroprotectors that are beyond the geriatrics. Okay, and also to start it, why don't we start it before we start aging, rather than try to run behind our tails and catch it somehow.
Nir, we just wanted to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to speak with us. If people want to learn more about the work that you're doing, how should they, I don't want to use the word contact, but how should they look you up? Where should they find out more info about you?
Well, I would suggest to go to the site of the American Federation of Aging Research, because you'll get, which, by the way, I'm the scientific director. I should disclose that I'm their scientific director, but this is the organization that really jump-started this biology of aging effort decades ago, and very successfully. And you'll find podcasts, and you'll find lots of ways. If you want to do something with aging, if you want to measure something, there's lots of help. There's centers. My center provides a course where you can do things. So I think American Federation of Aging Research is going to be a good way to know more about what I'm doing. If you're interested in metformin, look at PubMed in my name. There are 2 papers. Well, there are several papers, but one of them described the idea of the TAME, and the second one, which is more recent, and I talked about it, described the biology and how it targets the hallmarks of aging. So I think that's enough. I wish everybody success. I think that I really believe that it's going to be very different medicine once we can target aging. It's going to influence how we practice medicine very significantly.
Yeah, thank you so much, and have a great weekend.
It's good to spread the gospel, and you young guys are the future. So I'm counting on you.
Well, you're also going to be there if you keep taking metformin. All right, have a good one, Nir.
I have a good.
Take care. If you'd like to support us, here are some ways you can help. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, preferably a phenomenal review. Visit us at externalmedicinepodcast.com and tell your friends.